how can you critique me for this when there's such a glaring problem in your life?
Welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. I'd like to welcome back Scott Steen to our Blanket Fort studio.
Hi, Shawn.
And I'd like to welcome our listeners to our fourth episode in our Deconstruction series. And if you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to any of the previous three, we'd invite you to do that. Today's question we are dealing with is, isn't pointing out people's sin being judgmental? And what we're really dealing with in these questions, Scott, are questions that people are struggling with that may be leading them to deconstruction. Is that right?
Yeah, we've kind of, as we've been listening to people's stories, reading about people's stories, we've just kind of harvested some questions that we feel are they're being reflected in some of the struggles that people express.
Sure.
As they bump up against their own doubts and uncertainties about the Christian faith maybe they've grown up with or as they've understood it.
Sure.
And so we're trying to do this question approach as opposed to dealing with faith deconstruction in more of a, kind of academic
Sure.
dissection of ideas. We want to try and make it relevant and relevant to the kinds of real questions that people are struggling with.
Sure.
So in one way, we're kind of cherry picking, but we are, in an informed way, we're looking at the kinds of questions people have.
So when you were talking about how people are feeling about some of these issues, maybe there's a good place to start. There's some observations from a report called Hemorrhaging Faith. I think this is taken from 2012. Is that right?
Yeah, Hemorrhaging Faith was a study done here in Canada, sponsored by a number of groups. Youth for Christ was one. There were a number of other Christian agencies that kind of commissioned this report.
Right.
And it really was a study in the state of faith among Christian youth in Canada and looking at and trying to analyze many of the reasons why so many Christian young people growing up in Christian homes, were departing from their faith commitments.
Sure.
And so it was a very eye-opening report. It was very useful. But one of the great aspects of it was they actually not only did they do quantitative analysis of data, they also did individual interviews,
right,
where they got personal feedback and personal responses.
Yeah.
And it's just provided some good insights into the way some people are thinking.
Yeah, for sure. And on this topic of being judgmental, there's actually a couple good quotes that I'm going to read, one from Don and one from Lois here, and that's probably a good place to start our discussion today. So I'll start with Dawn.
All right, let's do that.
And so Dawn says, I'll keep her name anonymous, but a girl in my life would tell me that because I hadn't prayed that special prayer or been dipped or anything like that, that I was going to hell. And there'd be people who were Christian kids in my life who would say, how would you expect to get to heaven if you're acting like that? Or why should you get to heaven? You're this, you're that, you do these things. And so for me, that was what I was told God and Jesus was and what they were all about. So I said, well, they don't exist to me. Very, very insightful. And again, interesting. Like you said, these are direct quotes from youth that are struggling with these issues.
Yep.
The next one from Lois says, the way church members spoke about homosexuals completely turned me off. They were very judgmental. And I didn't like it at all because who are you to judge someone for something like that? Personally, I think you should look at yourself, pull the plank out of your own eye before you go for someone else's. And so that's from Lois. And honestly, Scott, I mean, they do have a point. Matthew 7:1 says, do not judge or you too will be judged. So what's going on? I mean, we've had this verse from Matthew. We've talked about, being judgmental in the church and that being an issue. But in the past, this hasn't really led to people leaving the church or maybe deconverting their faith. So has something changed?
Yeah, certainly not I mean, it probably always has, but certainly not in such a notable way that, now researchers are seeing this as a trend.
Sure. And
it's actually being documented that way. And yeah, that's a good question. What is it that's going on here such that an entire generation, this cohort, in 2012, it was the millennials.
Right.
Now we talk about Gen Z as kind of that leading generation, maybe even beyond now. But at any rate, it represents kind of the reflections of a new generation. And this is one of the reactions of this distaste for what appears to be the spirit of judgmentalism
Right.
in Christianity. And of course, we're painting everything with a broad brush as we're talking here.
Yeah.
But the trends are worth examining. So what is going on? And I think there are a number of things that I would say, and we're going to try and touch on them here, Shawn.
Yeah.
I think before we get into, there are a few observations I want to make.
Sure.
Before we get into that, we talked about our objective through this series is very much to try and help the Christian, the person who is wrestling through maybe what they would describe as a process of deconstructing or reconstructing their faith, or simply just to say they're struggling with their faith and they have doubts and questions.
Yep.
And we don't want to shy away from them. We don't want to ignore them, but to address them.
Right.
And what we're trying to do is help people, just develop or adopt some good methods of dealing with them.
Sure.
So I think one of our goals in that we mentioned earlier in one of our earlier episodes is even just helping Christians who may be going through these kinds of processes to learn to ask the right questions.
Right. Yeah.
And so part of that means not just asking, I think, the right questions about what you believe, but also asking the right questions about your questions, which may sound kind of, it sounds like a fortune cookie wisdom there.
Exactly.
So let me put it another way. In other words, I think part of any honest evaluation of your Christian faith requires that you honestly evaluate yourself in the process.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'll just go back to one of the examples you gave there that I completely resonate with, I think, the sentiment behind it, but just something I'd like to observe about the statement itself. The young woman who mentioned, and this is something that's reflected among many in millennial and Gen Z generations, is their reaction to what has historically been, and in many ways, a rightful critique, is the mistreatment or the poor treatment of people who would identify themselves in an LGBTQ way, part of that an LGBTQ identity, and that young people are saying, this is not right.
Right. Yeah.
That itself is an entire conversation to be had. But what I think is interesting in the statement she made was this. In her reaction to that, she said, I didn't like it, what she perceived as this judgmentalism towards, in particular, homosexuals. She said, I didn't like it at all because who are you to judge someone for something like that, right?
Right.
So there's the objection. And so, so this person is questioning the rightness of who are Christians to make those kinds of judgments, right?
Right.
But obviously, right, that in itself is a judgment.
Yes.
Right? She thinks that's wrong. Okay, fine, fair enough.
Yeah.
But if she's being honest, then the conviction she's formed, which appears to undermine what she perceives as Christian convictions, must be able to withstand the same level of examination, right? She needs to be able to say, okay, so I'm evaluating this as wrong,
Yeah.
but what is my basis for making the evaluation? And does that stand up to scrutiny?
Right.
And on surface, I would say, just in looking at her statement itself, I don't think it does.
Right.
Because on the surface, her response was, or her answer was, who are you to do that?
Right.
Personally, she says, I think you should look at yourself. Pull the plank out of your own eye before you go for someone else's. And in one way, she's kind of appealing to, it seems like an understanding of something Jesus said, which is worth exploring.
Sure.
But what I think is interesting is her leading word. Personally, I think, right?
Yeah.
So I just say all that as kind of preamble to simply encourage our listeners who might be moving through their own faith or doubt, deconstruction, reconstruction journey, however you want to put it, that as you submit your understanding of Christian faith to examination, that you be willing to honestly submit yourself to examination as well.
Right.
Because I think, being open to the possibility that while reconstructing your faith may involve a change in understanding to what constitutes the core essence of Christian faith, which is what we're trying to get at, Shawn, in our discussion, right?
Right.
Absolutely. We want to help people. If you're reconstructing your faith, we want to reconstruct the faith.
Right.
So let's get to the core.
Right.
But in that process, just be open to the fact that it might be equally true that in this process you may need to make changes to yourself.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Do you think part of this might be that people perceive that when they come to maybe Reconstruction, that they think they're coming as a blank slate, that they have no preconceived judgments or ideas or anything like that? And that honestly can't really be true, can it?
No. Well, I think you're right. I think there's as much as there is, and maybe we'll touch on this in a second, as much as there is a critique in our culture to say, no one has a perspective of objectivity from which to make these kinds of moral judgments.
Right.
At the same time, it does seem as though the people who are often make these kinds of critiques are themselves almost portraying that they have a neutral standpoint from which to say, that's wrong. You cannot do that. Right. And I think we need to recognize that we're all standing somewhere from which we make our moral pronouncements. We're all appealing to some base of authority. And so I think we need to be able to honestly evaluate and say, okay, so is my base of authority, can it stand to scrutiny? Right. So why have concerns, back to your question, why have concerns about judgmentalism, as these comments reflect?
Right. We've had Matthew 7:1 for time and eternity. Right. So why has this become
so why is this becoming so much bigger now? Why is it kind of on the radar as a part of this struggle people are having to hang on to their Christian faith? Well, I think there are a number of factors, Shawn. And all that preamble was to say I think part of it is to look at what's actually happened in Christianity. Part of it is also to be willing to scrutinize what's been happening in our culture, which ultimately reflects in the way we think.
Sure.
Part of that is, I think, Shawn, just to recognize that deconstruction, we're talking about faith deconstruction, and we're using the word deconstruction we're selectively using it to mean something that, there are Christians even are using that term in many ways. We're talking about it in more of a way of, if you're going through a process of trying to really reevaluate what it is exactly you believe. But deconstruction in itself, actually, where we've gotten the word from, it comes from a broader cultural movement, which is, and I don't want to get into this because I don't want to talk philosophy, but it began as a philosophical movement. It's a shift in the way we think, ultimately leading to us developing as a culture a very skeptical stance toward and a suspicion toward any kind of authoritative truth claims, especially religious or moral ones. But that skepticism itself rests upon some very authoritatively held claims. And I'm going to link an article that I read recently, which is a good overview of defining deconstruction in this more broad sense.
Not just specific to the Christian faith.
No, not just specific to Christian faith, but also not. You don't have to have an MA or a PhD in philosophy to read this article. It's just I think it's a ground level, but it is goes more into depth. But I think one of recognizing that there are some truth claims that are being held as people have formed this skeptical stance toward authoritative truth claims. Some of them being, first of all, that all knowledge is ultimately a psychological construct, right? So wrapped up into this, and this is, again, we're talking about a shift in the way our culture thinks. That our culture has shifted in the way we even think about how do we form knowledge in the first place. And the big shift that's taken place is that the locus of knowledge formation has moved away from reason and science and things like that to psychology, to the way that we as individuals perceive the world. And that the idea that human language, the way we perceive the world and speak about the world, isn't communicating some objective truth about the way reality really is, but only how I as an individual conceive of it at any given time. Which then spills over to the way that we look at written texts, like the Bible. That looking back, and that an author in the Bible isn't really writing real truth about the world.
But their perception of it.
But they're recording an account of the way they encountered reality
Yeah.
and perceived it in their own, historical, cultural, linguistic context at the time.
Right.
And so the process of deconstruction is a philosophical move to say that this is ultimately what constitutes knowledge. And so what we need to do to really get at the meaning, if we can really get at real meaning, is we need to deconstruct
Okay.
the way that the individual in the time understood reality,
Okay.
and then reconstruct for ourselves in our time, right, what their experience of, it's confusing. It's very confusing.
Sure it is.
But ultimately what it does, Shawn, the way it manifests itself at the street level, culturally, is that it's produced a very skeptical stance in our culture about knowledge, especially religious or moral knowledge.
Yeah.
And again, without needing to become an expert in philosophy, I just think it's worth alerting us as Christians, alerting you, if you're listening, to the fact that our culture has preconditioned us to be skeptical.
Yeah. So maybe throw out a couple examples that we would see in daily life. So what are things that would be evidence of this? I'm thinking like fake news. So this whole notion that there's no truth in the news that we're reading, that our culture is skeptical of even, well, we heard it recently, mainstream media.
Yeah.
We can't listen to mainstream media.
Well, I think that is probably a good street-level manifestation of the skepticism,
Right.
right? That the charge being that in media today, now we know there is no objective media. It's all perspectival. It's all bias.
Right.
And this has left us as a culture in a really difficult spot. Now we just doubt everything.
Right. Right.
So who do we listen to really, can we really know what's really going on?
And then we have phrases like "live your truth."
Well, that's more at the level of individual, kind of fulfilling my own truths kind of thing.
Right.
But to go back to this example of fake news, I mean, you can just see how our culture, how our society is really it's polarizing. There's so much fear because there's no, there's no shared, we now have no shared means
Right.
of coming to know what's really true in the world.
Right.
And then so ultimately, then what are we left with?
Right.
And we'll talk about that in a minute, which I think is kind of leading to our next point.
Sure.
But I think that's a great illustration of how it's manifesting itself.
Sure.
There's so little constructive dialogue going on in the media.
Right.
Right? It's all really, news media has almost all become commentary. No one's really listening to each other anymore.
No. So that's an example within society. So I can see then what you're talking about in terms of deconstruction could flourish within that. Right. This notion of questioning. Right. If I'm living in this society that's now questioning the news and all that kind of stuff, then yes, of course, deconstruction makes sense.
Right. Well, I think it's simply produced the environment
Yeah.
of skepticism and doubt
Sure.
that we live in, and I think we have to recognize it's having an impact on us.
Right.
And so, as a Christian, I have to realize, okay, I'm struggling with my own faith here, but I have to realize I'm being impacted by the culture at the same time.
Yeah.
So not to presume that my struggle is that I've attained some kind of a solid ground of objectivity,
Right.
and now I'm opening my eyes and I can see what's really the case about Christianity.
Yeah.
I have to be able to evaluate even just my own assumptions at the same time.
Are there other parts to our culture that may be influencing this?
Yeah, I think another factor I would mention would be just that we do live in a culture of kind of a high sensitivity to, I would call, a pseudo-tolerance.
Okay.
Tolerance is the virtue du jour in our culture, right? This whole movement of diversity, inclusivity, and equity, right? That seems to be permeating everything, especially in higher education.
Sure.
But so that we're pre-programmed, right, to have this virtue or a value set that highly values tolerance,
Right.
which you can appreciate would naturally make judgment making
Yes.
seem very inappropriate.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Understandably so. But of course, I think we have to recognize, right, even among the champions of tolerance only goes so far, as is being displayed so clearly, right, in our increasingly volatile reactions of cancel culture, right, especially in higher education. There's judgments galore taking place.
Oh, yes.
I came across a really interesting study. Actually, it's more of a resource. The National Association of Scholars. There's a huge crisis that academics are trying to raise awareness of going on in academia, where this whole kind of this movement of this progressive movement of enforcing tolerance has kind of gone awry. And the National Association of Scholars actually has conducted a study. They've produced this spreadsheet. They've actually gone back in the news archives, right? The archives of news history, to see where this cancel culture has been manifesting itself in higher education, where professors would espouse an idea that's not politically correct, and be then censored, or fired, right, or whatever. It's really interesting. So I just went back. I mean, it's just pages and pages of kind of here's the case, here's the source, here's the article, here's what happened. It goes all the way back to 1975.
Wow.
So this is just the interesting part. So Shawn, it's kind of spotty. It goes 1975, then again 1988, 2003, 2007, 2010, and in each of those years there was one incident that was recorded in the media and made note of, where a professor said something politically incorrect, faced censure, and lost their position or whatever. 2012, 2014, there were 2. 2015, 2016, there were 7. 2017, there were 11. 2018, there were 18. 2019, there were 19. In 2020, there were 83. It's like something exploded in the culture. That suddenly there was this temperature of kind of moral outrage against anything said that went against the grain of kind of this progressive diversity, equity, inclusivity doctrine. If you speak against it, you are absolutely crucified. And if you're an academic, you lose your position. And one of the concerns, and Jordan Peterson wrote an article in the Post about this not that long ago, about the abject fear there is among academics now.
Well, you just look at those figures.
Yeah.
No, that's scary.
So let's be honest. Judgmentalism is not a uniquely Christian problem.
No.
We live in a culture of judgmentalism.
It's almost become hyper.
Yeah, almost. But I don't think people see it. And I think that's where, again, we want to help people just to, before we just proceed in trying to critique or scrutinize or evaluate our faith commitments, we need to be equally introspective in evaluating the impact our culture has had in the way we think and the sensibilities that we have. Something else I realized too, Shawn, is that we live in a multicultural and religiously pluralistic culture. And I think part of what's happened in terms of Christianity, and this is where I think there are some parts of Christian culture, and I think as we talk more, what I'm recognizing, Shawn, is that so much of what's coming under scrutiny is not so much Christian doctrine as Christian culture.
Interesting.
And I think something that could be critiqued, or maybe is a reality of the fact that the West was predominantly Christian, historically, and that's not the case anymore. And as with any, as could tend to be in any case where there's a very homogenous culture and society and belief set, in that kind of environment, it's easy to look at people outside of your society or culture as somehow different or worse, or you caricature them.
Sure. Yeah.
The idea that it could be that that people of other religions were portrayed in a very negative light. And I'm not at all saying that's right. No. I'm just saying that that's probably part of the equation. And of course, what you have, the reality today is that, we're multicultural.
Sure.
So my neighbor is a Muslim from the Middle East, and my other neighbor is a Hindu from India.
And they're decent people.
And they're really nice people. Yeah. And very kind.
Right.
And they're my friends, and they do nice things for me. And so, the caricature that people who aren't Christians
are a certain way
are not good people, well, absolutely gets shattered.
Sure.
And rightly so.
Sure.
But I think at the same time, what that does is it reveals, and this is the last thing I think it reveals some theological drift, some doctrinal drift that has seeped into, I think, maybe Western Christian culture over time. And by that I mean, I think that in many cases, Christians or movements of Christianity may have lost sight of what the gospel really is all about.
Okay.
And so if I grow up in a tradition where I'm taught that the gospel of Jesus is all about becoming good people, right? That God's greatest interest in us is being a good person. And we spoke about this last time, I think our first episode, we talked about views about Jesus, where in progressive Christianity and historically liberal Christianity, Jesus was not seen as the divine Son of God. He was seen as maybe a divine man or an ultimately very good man, but what it boiled down to is that God sent him as an example of sorts to show us how to be the right kind of person. Right. Well, if you grow up in that kind of a setting and that's your understanding of Christianity, and then you look and see your Muslim neighbor is a good person and your Hindu neighbor is a good person, and you think, well, wait a minute now. Yeah. So Christianity is not the only religion producing good people. Right. So who are we to say, right? And I think that's where I think part of the equation might be the theological drift that's set in. Sure. Where Christianity has become, in the eyes of many, a religion about works. Right. Of doing the right things or becoming the right kind of person. Right. And I think that kind of view naturally breeds a judgmental spirit. Sure.
So then would you say that it's a matter of Christians just ignoring the teaching of Jesus?
Well, I'm not sure it's that simple. I'd say there probably, at least if we're talking about, I think we're talking about this kind of this last thing we said, is that I think there's been some theological drift. Right. I think in saying that, I think there's probably three things that are going on or have gone on. Okay. One is that in general, when Christians lose sight of the true meaning of the gospel and Christianity turns into a religion intended to just make really good people, it is very easy to develop a judgmental spirit. Sure it is. So in that case, it's not really the case of ignoring Jesus' teaching. It's a case of missing the point of the gospel entirely. Yeah. Right? Yep. And I think Paul makes this really clear in Romans. He says in Romans 2:1, he says, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same thing." And he's starting in Romans Romans chapter 1 is where he diagnoses the human condition, and which is the very essence of the gospel in terms of the need for Christ. Right. Which is ultimately our sin, our fallenness before God. He goes on in chapter 3, in verse 11, to say there's no one righteous, not one, right? And later in verse 23, for all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. If you're working to recover your faith, again, we're just going to keep saying this, we want to work to recover the faith. And so that means if you've grown up in a tradition that has emphasized just Christianity is about producing the best kind of person, and you look at the Christians around you and compare them with others in the world and realize they're no better or maybe not the best kind of persons, we need to get back to Scripture and reevaluate what is at the core. Right. And this does spring off of our last conversation on the need to speak to the issue of sin. Sure. Because what's ultimately at issue here is not that we aren't good people. It's that spiritually we are alienated from the God who created us.
Right.
We are in spiritual rebellion
Right.
against him. And that's the issue that has to be addressed.
So is there any place for judgment? Does Jesus teach that there's any place for judgment?
Well, yes, and I think that's another aspect, or that's another thing I think we need to speak to, because the question is, is this just a matter of have we ignored the teaching of Jesus? In the first part, I think what's happened is that we have lost sight, or many have lost sight of what the gospel is really about. That needs to be recovered. The second, I think, yes, I think we maybe have misunderstood the teaching of Jesus when it comes to judgment. First, I think we've maybe muddied the meaning of the word judgment.
Okay.
Right? And so, let's discuss for a second what we mean or what Jesus meant by judge.
Okay.
So, often that's quoted. You quoted that verse in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1.
Yep.
Do not judge lest ye be judged. And that's usually the one most people remember and are quick to cite.
Right. Yep.
Forgetting that it's part of a larger passage of teaching. But, so a passage that really looks at judgment in two ways. You can look at judgment in the way that Jesus is meaning it in that verse,
Okay.
which is ultimately hypocritical judgmentalism.
Okay.
The plank in your eye as you
Okay.
point out the speck in someone else's.
Right.
That is just plain hypocrisy. Right? How can you critique me for this
Right.
when there's such a glaring problem in your life?
Yes.
And it's this taking a posture of, I'm in a position to deliberate judgment upon you.
Right.
Well, Jesus says there's no room for that.
No.
And that's the passage I mentioned from Paul in Romans 2.
Right.
You who pass judgment have no excuse.
Right.
For whatever you say about your neighbor, at some point,
Yes, could be true about
in
you.
thought or deed, you've done the same thing.
Yes.
Right. So there's no place for that in the Christian economy, social economy, hypocritical judgmentalism.
Yeah.
But then the word judge itself, though, really just means discernment between right and wrong.
Right.
And there are many instances in the Gospels, Matthew chapter 12, John chapter 7, that Jesus actually tells us to judge. Judge between what's right and wrong. Judge for yourself what is right.
Yeah.
And that's not judgmentalism. No. That's just the work of discerning.
Sure. Yes.
Discern between what's good and evil, between what's right and wrong. And Paul uses the same term. So maybe part of the problem is also in the way that we use the word judge. And I like the way Carey Nieuwhof said it. I was reading something he'd written, a blog post about judgmentalism in the church. He says, when it comes to dealing with problems inside the church, we are called to judge. But judgment is a loaded term in our culture.
Right.
He says the original Greek term is a little less loaded because it just means to decide.
Oh, interesting.
Decide between what's right and wrong.
Sure.
So maybe a very quick response then to the problem of judgmentalism, given our cultural context, is to agree that Christians should not judge others, taking a posture of judgmentalism. We do and should, however, practice discernment about good and evil. Now, second, you quoted again, judge not lest you be judged. We talked about the difference between hypocritical judgmentalism and discernment, making a sound judgment.
Right.
But there's more to Jesus' teaching in that passage in Matthew 7.
Yeah.
And again, we can't just quote one verse. We have to look at everything Jesus said.
Right.
He says, do not judge or you will be judged, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now, this is not a warning that God will judge you according to whatever standard of judgment you use to judge other people. Because God judges according to his own standard, right? He doesn't use our sinful, flawed standards of judgment. I think what Jesus is saying is more in line with, again, going back to Paul's admonition in Romans 2:1. Whatever point you pass judgment on them, you're judging yourself, right? In other words, the measure you use to judge someone else is going to come back to haunt you because you're going to do the same thing. And so it's going to backfire on you, and you will indict yourself.
Right.
You judge that person for that. Look, you've done that, you hypocrite.
Yes.
right? And it'll just bring shame on you.
Right.
So that's the warning. But then Jesus goes on and says, and this is the picture, right? Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in yours? You hypocrite, right? There's the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's. Now, there's just 3 comments I want to make about what Jesus is getting at in this passage.
Mm-hmm.
The obvious point we've already talked about. Jesus condemns hypocritical judgmentalism,
Right.
right? But there's 3 things to note. First, he says in the process, the point for Jesus of removing the plank is so that we can see clearly to make a true judgment,
Right.
so that we can clearly see to discern
Right.
what we need to point out to our brother. And the purpose of that is in order to help remove the speck, right,
Yep.
in my brother's eye. So the goal is genuinely helping. It's not that I have never any right to say anything about the speck in my brother's eye. The point is, I need to make sure that I am seeing clearly in order to do that, in which case I have to soberly look at my own life at the same time.
Right.
And then the last thing, just to point out that Jesus says he's referring to your brother. Okay, that is Christian language,
Right.
right? And not talking about your biological brother.
No.
That is Christian language. It would seem that even in his teachings, Jesus has a particular context in mind, and the context is living in Christian community. So I think that's important to recognize. That I think we would be wrong to so quickly dismiss making judgments and say, you know what, there's no place for judging in the Christian economy.
Right.
I think that would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
I think it would be misapplying and misunderstanding Jesus' teaching on judgment. And we want to be careful not to do that.
So, Scott, should Christians even be pointing out people's sin in the first place?
If we look at the teaching of Jesus
Yeah.
and the example, the outworking of Jesus' teaching in the record of the New Testament church, I think we'd answer that question in 2 parts.
Okay.
Within the church community, within the body of Christ, I think the answer to that question seems to be yes,
Okay.
right?
Yep.
And listen again to Jesus' teaching. Here's Jesus in Matthew 18. Now, if your brother sins, okay, this is Jesus,
Yes.
okay?
Yep. Right.
Not me, this is
No.
Jesus.
No.
If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private.
Right.
If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he doesn't listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every matter may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, he is to be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. There's so much packed in there, but Jesus is essentially laying out a template for how within the church community, within the body of Christ,
Right.
Christians are to deal with one another when it comes to the pervasiveness or the prevalence of sin in our lives.
So if he's laying out a way to do this, obviously this is important.
It is important, and that's my fear. That's my fear in Christians reacting to judgmentalism,
Right.
hypocritical judgmentalism, which is wrong.
Right.
That in reaction to that, our overreaction would be, so there's no judgment then,
Right.
right? I don't have any place, there's no place in my world for me to ever point out someone's
Right.
sin.
Right.
Well, in the church, actually, that is a responsibility we have to one another.
Right.
And it is the way that we exercise and demonstrate and show brotherly love in Christ.
Okay.
That is so countercultural, Shawn.
I was just going to say
that if you know, probably I'm surprised my microphone has not exploded.
Right. So you're saying we judge out of love? Is that the new Christian mantra? But you're right to say that. Seems so countercultural.
Yeah, and again, you know, we're running out of time. This episode, I don't want it to go too long.
Yeah.
But I think that does betray, again, as we started off saying, we need to step back in the process of reevaluating what it is we believe and question our starting assumptions.
Right.
And make sure that we do not import cultural sensibilities into the church
Right.
and lay those expectations on the floor of church community.
Right.
It's Christ who orders the way that we live within the church.
Yes.
Now, quickly then getting to the other part of the answer to your question is there a place to point out people's sin? Inside the church, yes, and there's more we could teach about that, and I think that's a worthwhile subject to pursue. If we're talking about those outside the church, I think more often than not the answer is no.
Interesting.
And again, that's the short answer.
Sure.
But let me just quote Paul here in 1 Corinthians 5. He's writing to the church. He's writing and he's speaking to issues of sin within the church, and he's instructing the church on how they should deal with an ongoing sin issue in the church.
Right.
That there's some Christians who are involved in sinful behavior and they're not repentant. They're persisting and they're not,
Right.
Paul's giving them instructions. And so he's speaking to this, and this is what he says in verse 9 of chapter 5 in 1 Corinthians. He says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. The sin ongoing was sin of a sexual nature.
Yeah.
So don't associate with sexually immoral people. And then he qualifies that. He says, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. That is, in other words, those people outside of the church. He says, in that case, you'd have to leave the planet.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Putting the Great Commission into question.
you would be negating the Great Commission of going into the world.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
He says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. That's not our place.
Right.
Right. So again, he is reinforcing what Jesus taught.
Right.
That within the church, we are to discern and, what's right and wrong, what's sinful and righteousness. And where we see sin in each other's lives, out of love, we're to call it out.
Right.
Not annoyingly so.
Right.
We all
Exactly.
sin, but if it's a persistent, faith-threatening kind of sin that threatens to undermine the testimony of Jesus and to place you outside of being within God's place where God can bless you, then the loving thing for me to do is to call you out of that. Put that away so that you can return to fellowship with the Lord and be in a place where He can bless your life.
Right.
But for those outside, and again, I'm speaking in general terms.
Yes.
For the day-to-day relationships we have with other people, we really don't have a right to judge or a place to point out people's sins as a part of our witness in the world. Why would we expect people who aren't followers of Jesus, who aren't Christians, to behave like Christians?
Right.
I would not behave like a Christian if Jesus had not opened my eyes and brought me under conviction by his Holy Spirit, and shown me what sin was. Right. Apart from that, I would be living the same way.
Right.
So why would I expect that until someone comes to see their need for Jesus?
Right.
Now, so that I would say is in the day-to-day, workaday life of interaction.
Right.
I'm not saying there isn't a place for the church collectively to speak into the culture against issues of good and evil. Okay. And a good illustration would be, the church's voice collectively speaking into the culture about issues like abortion.
Right.
Is there a place for that? Yes.
Sure.
I think there is.
Yes.
But I'm just talking about, our personal interactions with the people we rub shoulders with every day.
Right.
Now, again, just pointing back to last time's episode, in sharing the gospel, there may also, and there will also come a time where we will need to speak to the matter of sin.
Right.
But not in the finger-wagging way.
No.
Right? More in the...
bringing people to an awareness of.
Right. The awareness of their sin and then their need for forgiveness and for Jesus' redeeming work.
Right.
To rescue them from their sin.
Right.
So yeah, that's a quick answer, I guess. There's so much we could say.
Sure.
It's, we're just unpacking so much of...
And I think that's a great place to start, Scott. And And I would say you did a good job today, Scott. I'm going to judge you.
Wow, that's a fair judgment, Shawn. I won't.
So, but appreciate those words, and on a topic that is so relevant for today, for our culture, and also for the church. And like you said, there's a lot more to be said about this. I think we touched on judgment within the church, but like you said, we just touched on it.
Yeah.
And probably our listeners could go to further resources on our website at preparedtoanswer.org and in contact if necessary. But I appreciate that, and I look forward to having you back with us next time. Until then, take care. God bless.
This podcast has been a ministry of Prepared to Answer. Our mission at Prepared to Answer is to help prepare, equip, and encourage the Church of Jesus Christ to grow in confidence of faith by teaching Christians to think like Jesus. To access more resources to help you begin understanding life and the world around you with the mind of Jesus, visit our website at www.preparedtoanswer.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at preparedtoanswer, or contact us directly by email at info@preparedtoanswer.org. May the Lord bless and keep you.